A year ago, Sean Combs stood in Times Square and was handed a key to New York City. Today, he's been indicted and will face justice in the Southern District of New York.
One of the most famous names in the hip-hop world is now facing 3 charges in federal court. Many people have come forward in recent months to accuse Sean Diddy Combs of abuse, sex trafficking, drug possession, and more, but now the federal government is getting involved and promising to bring down the rap mogul's alleged criminal empire.
Office is determined to investigate and prosecute anyone who engages in sex trafficking, no matter how powerful or wealthy or famous you may be. No one should doubt our commitment on that.
Talk about a day in the legal and crime world. And today, it all centers around Sean Diddy Combs and all of these details and filings in his new criminal case. And we're going to break it down for you right now, give you everything you need to know. So, the Southern District of New York is promising justice for multiple victims who say that rapper, producer, businessman Combs used his power, influence, and wealth to intimidate them into doing his bidding, whether that was obtaining drugs or performing sexually or cleaning up after apparent sex acts. Now, we've of course been reporting on Combs for months here on Sidebar. In November of last year, Cassandra Ventura, Cassie Combs' ex, filed a huge lawsuit against him, claiming that he abused her physically, sexually, emotionally for years before she was finally able to get away. Now, Combs denied everything she had to say in her filing. He settled the lawsuit with her just one day after it was filed, but we know that set off a chain reaction. Multiple other lawsuits against him and even against his son were filed, alleging sexual abuse, sex trafficking, illegal narcotics possession, violence. Then, in March of this year, Homeland Security agents, they show up at Combs' homes in both Miami and Los Angeles, search warrants in hand. They raided both locations, seemingly collecting a huge amount of evidence, which we will get through in a moment. And we learned at the time that this was connected to a sex trafficking investigation out of the Southern District of New York, but we didn't know all the exact details. Well, you fast forward to this week, and Combs was officially arrested Monday night at the Park Hyatt Hotel in New York out in Manhattan. According to his defense team, he had been booked there since September 5th, that was nearly 2 weeks ago, and he was in town in anticipation of the charges being filed, which is important because now that Combs has been arrested and charged, he says this is an example to show he's not a flight risk. He's been cooperative. However, when U.S. Attorney Damian Williams, again from the Southern District of New York, held a press conference and was asked about Combs' cooperation in this case, he seemed skeptical.
Let me just say this. I think that generally with increasing frequency, the word cooperative or cooperating has taken on tremendous elasticity, and it no longer really bears any relation to what the word means when we use it in a very specific context. So responding to lawful process and the like does not qualify as cooperation when we use that term here.
Now, there are still questions about future filings, possible charges against co-conspirators, whether Combs will be hit with additional charges. What we do know is we are now getting a look at what the prosecution believes they can prove. And that brings me to this major indictment against Sean Combs. So, prosecutors filed documents in federal court that lay out the accusations against Combs and his associates. Although, to be clear, Combs is the only one named in this filing for now. He faces 3 charges: racketeering conspiracy, sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion, and transportation to engage in prostitution. Now, during a hearing on Tuesday, Combs entered a not guilty plea to every charge. And if he is convicted of all charges, Combs faces a minimum of 15 years in prison with the possibility that the 54-year-old could spend the rest of his life behind bars. That's what we're talking about here. So we're going to break down each of these counts for you, as well as more on why Combs says he should be allowed out on bail while he waits trial. And let's start with the indictment. It's 14 pages, jam-packed with information. I want to hit the highlights. So first, right out of the gate, the government lays out some pretty damning accusations. Quote, "For decades, Sean Combs, a.k.a. Puff Daddy, a.k.a. PDiddy, Diddy, a.k.a. PD, Love," they, throughout the course of this indictment, refer to him by his many monikers, the defendant, abused, threatened, and coerced women and others around him to fulfill his sexual desires, protect his reputation, and conceal his conduct. To do so, Combs relied on the employees, resources, and influence of the multifaceted business empire that he led and controlled, creating a criminal enterprise whose members and associates engaged in and attempted to engage in, among other crimes, sex trafficking, forced labor, kidnapping, arson, bribery, and obstruction of justice. Which brings me now to count one, racketeering conspiracy. So the main idea here is that there is a criminal agreement, an agreement to engage in racketeering. And racketeering is when there is a criminal enterprise, it's like organized crime, a grouping of people who break the law. They commit crimes. Now, it doesn't need to be Sean Combs Breaks the Law LLC. You don't need an official company. Just an organized group of people, organized crime. And a criminal enterprise is supposed to have a common goal. So whether it was to benefit financially, whether it was to satisfy Sean Combs' sexual desires, whether it was to protect him, there has to be a common goal in mind. We saw this, we're seeing this actually, I should say, in the Young Thug trial out of Georgia. Big thing for the prosecution is they have listed a number of different crimes. They're trying to say this wasn't done in an individual capacity, but it was done to further that gang. Similar idea here. Okay. Now also, as you're going to see here, in a racketeering case, there are numerous predicate crimes. These are underlying crimes that Combs is not specifically charged with, like arson or kidnapping or forced labor, but they are crimes under the umbrella of the larger criminal enterprise. By the way, I should tell you, the racketeering allegations that we see in this indictment are very consistent with the allegations put forward by Rodney Little Rod Jones, Combs' former producer, who was one of the people that filed a sexual assault lawsuit against him and said there were violations of racketeering law. In fact, although no one is specifically named in this indictment, you can kind of see who those alleged victims of Combs are, their allegations, that they were the basis for the charges here, especially Cassandra Ventura. Because we all know that when that video back in 2016 was released by CNN a few months ago of Sean Combs purportedly beating Cassandra Ventura in a hotel elevator bank, that was publicized for the whole world to see, and he apologized for on Instagram. That is mentioned specifically in this indictment. Now, reading from the indictment, it says, quote, "The defendant and others, known and unknown, participated in unlawful and other activities related to the conduct of the Combs Enterprises affairs. These individuals included certain Combs business employees, such as members of Combs security staff, household staff, personal assistants, and high-ranking supervisors, as well as other close associates of Combs." Now, one of the most startling examples of Combs' alleged control over those around him came from the description of apparent sex parties called freak-offs. This is something that Ventura and others alleged in their lawsuits. What are they? Well, the indictment says Combs and other members and associates of the Combs enterprise wielded the power and prestige of Combs' role at the Combs business to intimidate, threaten, and lure female victims into Combs' orbit, often under the pretense of a romantic relationship. Combs then used force, threats of force, and coercion to cause victims to engage in extended sex acts with male commercial sex workers that Combs referred to as, among other things, freak-offs. Freak-offs were elaborate and produced sex performances that Combs arranged, directed, I'm not going to say the next part, basically pleasured himself during, and often electronically recorded. In arranging these freak-offs, Combs, with the assistance of members and associates of the Combs enterprise, transported and caused to be transported commercial sex workers across state lines and internationally. Freak-offs occurred regularly, sometimes lasted multiple days, and often involved multiple commercial sex workers. So this is also kind of a flavor of the sex trafficking charge, which we'll get to a little bit later. During freak-offs, Combs distributed a variety of controlled substances to victims, in part to keep the victims obedient and compliant. Sometimes, unbeknownst to the victims, Combs kept videos he filmed of victims engaging in sex acts with commercial sex workers. After freak-offs, Combs and the victims typically received IV fluids to recover from the physical exertion and drug use. The indictment then provides more details about what Combs expected his employees to do before, during, and after these sessions.
Now, Combs did not do this all on his own. As I mentioned, Combs has been charged with RICO conspiracy. He used his business and employees of that business and other close associates to get his way. Those individuals allegedly included high-ranking supervisors in the business, personal assistants, security staff, and household staff. The indictment alleges that those individuals facilitated the freak-offs. They booked the hotel rooms and stocked them with the supplies, including drugs, baby oil, personal lubricant, extra linens, and lighting. When the hotel rooms got damaged, they helped clean it up. They arranged for victims and commercial sex workers to travel for the freak-offs, and they delivered large quantities of cash to Combs to pay for the commercial sex workers.
According to the indictment, in or about March of 2024, during searches of Combs' residences in Miami, Florida, and Los Angeles, California law enforcement seized various freak-off supplies, including narcotics and more than 1,000 bottles of baby oil and lubricant. Wow, you talk about physical evidence here to prove these claims. Now, federal prosecutors allege that Combs used the threat of violence as well as actual assaults to keep his alleged victims in line. The indictment reads, quote, Combs maintained control over his victims through, among other things, physical violence, promises of career opportunities, granting and threatening to withhold financial support, and by other coercive means, including tracking their whereabouts, dictating the victim's appearance, monitoring their medical records, controlling their housing, and supplying them with controlled substances. During and separate from freak-offs, Combs, among other things, hit, kicked, threw objects at, and dragged victims at times by their hair. These assaults often resulted in injuries that took days or weeks to heal. Combs also threatened victims' careers and livelihoods, including if they resisted participating in freak-offs. So a majority of that indictment covers that first count, racketeering conspiracy. Now I want to talk quickly about the other two counts that he faces. So count 2 is a charge of sex trafficking of a victim by using force or coercion or fraud to have that person engage in commercial sex acts that are either for money or something of value is promised or given. And there were allegations that Combs had made promises of opportunities and so forth to get what he wanted. And he's also charged with count 3, which is related to the transportation of people for purposes of prostitution. Now, quick side note about this. This is a comprehensive indictment, but it doesn't have a lot of details about what evidence prosecutors have to prove all of this. It also doesn't include every allegation that has been asserted against Combs in numerous civil complaints. For instance, there is nothing regarding minors. There's been a lot of allegations that there were minors at these Combs parties, which we had heard before in these other allegations and these other complaints. Nothing about minors here. Now, Damian Williams, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, said that it's possible more charges could be on the way. He wouldn't confirm it one way or another, said nothing's off the table, so we don't know. But maybe there wasn't enough evidence to prove that there were minors at these parties or Combs did anything criminal related to minors. But I tell you what, we did get a lot more information from another filing from the prosecution. I'll get to that in a second. First, I have to get to the defense because in a letter filed with the court on Tuesday, Combs' defense team laid out a proposed bail package for their client, why he should be released pending trial. And they explained why his actions over the last 6 months point toward cooperation, not avoidance. They also call out the government for seemingly making things more difficult than they had to be. His team writes, quote, through counsel, Mr. Combs promptly told the government that he had voluntarily come to New York, offered to tell them specifically where he was, and offered to turn himself in at the appropriate time. Even though Mr. Combs came to New York, authorized his lawyers to tell the government of his location, and offered to self-surrender, the government effected an arrest last evening. This, we know, is the government's right. However, that he traveled to New York to self-surrender is also something the court should consider. So what is this bail package that the defense outlines? Well, here are some of the main points. 1, a $50 million bond co-signed by Combs, his mother, his sister, the mother of his eldest daughter, and his 3 adult sons. That $50 million would be secured by the equity in Combs' Miami home. The appraised value of that home on Star Island is $48 million. So in other words, this is what he's saying. You can secure this. You can know that I'm not going to flee the country. I'm not going to break the bail conditions. I'm putting this home up. The defense says that Combs paid off the remaining mortgage, $18 million, so he could use it to secure a bond. The equity in his mother's home in Miami could also be used as collateral. And the letter goes on to say that Combs' travel would be restricted to the Southern District of Florida and the Southern District of New York. Combs apparently surrendered his passport to his attorneys right after the raids on his home, and several of his family members, including his children, have surrendered their passports too. Combs' counsel says he is currently working on selling his private plane, so he wouldn't be able to just jet off to some exotic locale that has no extradition with the United States. In the bail package information, it's also revealed that Combs wants to be under house arrest and would agree to GPS monitoring. The letter from Combs' attorneys also fires back at the assistant U.S. attorneys working on the case, saying they reached out to him in the days before the raids but never got any reply. And then on March 25th, agents swooped in with a big show of force, which the attorneys insist was unnecessary. The filing also goes into Combs' philanthropic works, including his work with the Boys and Girls Club of America, his donations to open a charter school in New York, and his work fundraising to get PPE for frontline workers during the COVID-19 pandemic. At the end of the document, the defense team states Sean Combs has never evaded, avoided, eluded, or run from a challenge in his life. He will not start now. As he has handled every hardship, he will meet this case head on. He will work hard to defend himself, and he will prevail. Now, the prosecution had a different view. So the prosecution team also sent a letter to the judge defending their assertion that Combs should be locked up with no bail. Their letter states, quote, "As reflected by the gravity of the charges in the indictment, the defendant is dangerous and poses an ongoing threat to the safety of the community. If released, he remains a serious risk of flight despite the conditions offered by his counsel. Most glaringly, the defendant also poses a significant risk of obstructing justice." The letter also goes into more detail about some of those specific situations that Combs was allegedly involved in that point to the lengths he would reportedly go to get what he wanted. For example, quote, "The defendant ensured the victims would participate in freak-offs through coercion and violence. For instance, the defendant provided controlled substances, including ketamine, ecstasy, GHB, to female victims so that they could and would continue to engage in freak-offs despite fatigue, physical and emotional exhaustion, and pain. Additionally, both during freak-offs and separate from freak-offs, the defendant subjected female victims to physical, emotional, and verbal abuse in part to cause them to engage in freak-offs. The defendant hit, kicked, threw objects at, and dragged female victims, sometimes by their hair. At least a dozen witnesses will confirm that they personally observed the defendant's violence towards women and or the injuries sustained by women at the defendant's hand." Now, back to that 2016 video that I mentioned of Combs allegedly attacking Cassandra Ventura out in L.A., they say in this letter, prosecution, they claim that Combs used money and influence to try to keep that video from getting out. Quote, "When a member of hotel security staff intervened, the defendant attempted to offer their hotel security officer a stack of cash to ensure his silence. After the security guard refused the defendant's bribe and after coordination between the defendant and his employees, the defendant's staff contacted other members of hotel security. Within days of the incident, the surveillance video disappeared from the hotel's server." Now, this is the exact allegations put forward by Cassandra Ventura, which makes you wonder, is she one of the cooperating witnesses with the government? You have to believe so. And clearly, there is something to be said that the prosecutors here are believing the account of Ventura and possibly these other alleged victims. It's not just them filing a lawsuit against Sean Combs. They are believing these allegations to substantiate criminal charges. That's big. Now, the letter also references another alleged incident that was first revealed in Ventura's lawsuit last fall when she alleged that Combs set fire to fellow recording artist Kid Cudi's car when he seemed to show interest in Ventura. According to the filing, quote, "In the early morning hours of December 22nd, 2011, the defendant and a co-conspirator kidnapped an individual at gunpoint to facilitate breaking into and entering the residence of individual 1. Multiple witnesses would testify at trial to the events surrounding the kidnapping and break-in, the latter of which is corroborated by police reports and other records. Approximately 2 weeks later, the defendant's co-conspirator set fire to individual 1's vehicle by slicing open the car's convertible top and dropping a Molotov cocktail inside the interior. Police and fire department reports extensively document the arson and conclude that the fire was intentionally set. Multiple witnesses would also testify to the defendant bragging about his role in destroying individual 1's car." So again, prosecutors really taking Cassandra Ventura's allegations as true. And again, while he's not specifically charged with arson, that is a part of the racketeering charge. Goes on, the prosecution, they raised concerns about Combs' access to weapons as well, especially firearms. The letter includes photographs of weapons found in Combs' homes. Again, this is all the reason why they believe he should be denied bail. In March of 2024, during searches of the defendant's residences in Miami, Florida, and Los Angeles, California, law enforcement seized firearms and ammunition, including 3 AR-15s, each with defaced serial numbers, as well as a large capacity drum magazine. As pictured in a close-up image, the serial number of one of the AR-15s is visibly bored through and obscured. By the way, that in and of itself is a federal crime. We did an episode about the recent potential shooting of former President Donald Trump. That individual is charged with that crime. The filing goes on to state, quote, 2 of the 3 defaced AR-15s were found in the defendant's Miami bedroom closet, stored broken down in parts, along with magazines that were loaded with ammunition. In addition, 6 legally purchased guns with serial numbers, some of which were stored in gun safes, were recovered from the defendant's residences. Now, from there, in this bail letter, Combs is also accused of trying to influence witnesses. Prosecutors state, quote, specifically following the November 2023 lawsuit, the defendant and intermediaries acting on his behalf reached out to potential victims and witnesses to the alleged conduct, including individuals he did not speak to regularly and had not spoken to in years, to attempt to feed those victims and witnesses false narratives about the defendant's criminal conduct. For example, on or about November 19, 2023, just 3 days after the filing of the lawsuit described above, this is the Cassandra Ventura one, the defendant made multiple calls to another victim of his sexual abuse and recorded certain of those calls using the cell phone of a co-conspirator. During the calls, the defendant repeatedly asked for the victim's support and friendship and attempted to convince the victim that she had willingly engaged in acts constituting sexual abuse. The defendant also assured the victim that if she needed the defendant to, she ain't got to worry about nothing else. Quote, even more concerning, since learning about the criminal investigation, including following the execution of the search warrants at his residences, Combs contacted other witnesses on multiple occasions, including other witnesses who had received grand jury subpoenas, basically accusing him of obstruction. And by the way, the prosecution also points out that many of the crimes that Combs is accused of happened in his home. So putting him on house arrest, they would say, doesn't do much to mitigate potential wrongdoing inside his residence. Now they talk about the weight of the evidence, how much they have. Remember I said there wasn't a lot in the indictment? Well, here they talk about the weight of the evidence as a factor to consider in whether to deny bail. Quote, as to witnesses, to date, the government has conducted interviews with over 50 victims and witnesses, many of whom saw or experienced the defendant's abuse. Many of these witnesses corroborate one another, and their accounts are consistent with the other types of evidence discussed below. The government only expects that number to continue to grow, given that the investigation, which is now public, is ongoing. And also, the prosecution revealed in its filing that the government has seized more than 90 cell phones, laptops, cloud storage accounts, hard drives, thumb drives, cameras, a surveillance system that they say shows this criminal activity. So based on that, we can assume that the evidence the Southern District of New York has against Combs is likely vast. Quote, the evidence also consists of physical evidence, which was seized pursuant to search warrants executed at the defendant's residences in Los Angeles and Miami, as well as on his person and the persons of certain co-conspirators. In addition to the firearms and electronics discussed above, the physical evidence also includes other evidence of freak-offs, including over 1,000 bottles of baby oil and personal lubricant. Pretty disgusting. Now, we've gone over the 14-page indictment filed against Combs in the Southern District of New York, plus letters regarding bail sent to the judge by both the prosecution and the defense. You can check out the sidebar episode that we did there. We kind of did a deep dive. You can check it out on the Law and Crime Network YouTube page. But right now, what we want to talk about is something else. So the documents, what they do is they give us a better idea of what Homeland Security agents found inside of Combs' homes in Los Angeles and Miami when they were raided back in March, as well as other evidence that they have collected during the course of this investigation. The Southern District of New York is well known for being one of the top courts in the country. According to statistics from the United States Sentencing Commission in fiscal year 2023, the SDNY had more than 1,000 cases, and of those cases, 94% of the defendants ended up taking a plea, while only 6% chose to take their case to trial. And the court's conviction rate is reported to be 95%. So in other words, if the Southern District of New York prosecutors file charges against you, it's safe to assume they've done their homework and think that they have a really solid case. So the U.S. attorney here was asked during a news conference on Tuesday why the charges against Combs were brought in New York instead of Florida or California.
Well, I'm biased. I'm the U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York. I think that we have an outstanding track record of bringing some of the most impactful, sprawling, complex, difficult sex trafficking, human trafficking, labor trafficking, you name it. The Southern District of New York can do it, and so we're very proud of that. And so the scope and complexity of this investigation isn't something that we ran from, it's something that we embrace, and we will continue to do that.
Okay, I want to talk about some of the strongest pieces of evidence right now against Sean Combs, the rapper producer. And to do that, I want to bring in two special guests. I'm joined by Colin Schmidt, retired FBI agent, CEO of Kronos Investigations, and Robin Nunn, trial attorney and federal litigator. It's great to have you both here. So first, Colin, what is your reaction to Combs' arrest and Combs' indictment?
Well, I think I was on one of your shows at the very outset of this when the search warrant occurred, and I was asked, okay, why didn't they arrest him and indict him right on the spot? And my statement then was they're putting their case together because he's such a public figure and he has so many resources. They want to make sure they get it right. So when I saw this indictment, as well as the detention memo that the prosecutor put over, it looks to me like they really, really did their homework and they're really making sure that these charges stick.
So, Robin, what do you think? Because this is interesting. You heard Damian Williams say they're confident their office should handle it. You know, there were raids in California and Florida. There seemed to be a connection to New York, saying that this criminal organization, this criminal enterprise, was based or had headquarters in the Southern District. What do you make of this case being spearheaded by them, and what do you make of the indictment that we saw?
Yeah, there are no stronger prosecution unit than the Southern District of New York. They have a special unit that is designed to take cases such as these sex trafficking, RICO, organized crime rings. So I think Damian Williams is stating it pretty clearly and correctly that the Southern District of New York would be on anyone's top list of units of government agencies that would be able to handle something like this with a celebrity and the complexities and the number of witnesses, because it is such a elite and heavy conviction centered prosecution unit.
The indictment and the bail letter that was put forward by the prosecution, serious accusations. I mean, disturbing to say the least. And even though we don't know all the evidence, and we're going to get into some of it, they seem to be very confident in their case. But it also, we didn't know how many victims there were. It seems that one of the charges is at least with respect to just one victim. Racketeering cases can be complicated. But saying that, do you feel that this is a strong case based on the allegations put forward?
Yeah, this is one of the strongest sex trafficking cases that I've ever seen. While the indictment was not as detailed as I was expected, and there were some allegations that I suspected might be made that were not, such as, underage victims or, perhaps murder or, things like that. This was focused enough and had enough meat that I feel like it'll be very difficult, to sort of get out of these allegations. It seems like they've interviewed a number of witnesses. I think they said at least 50 victims and witnesses that have already been sort of interviewed and have agreed to cooperate in this, and I'm sure that there are many more, and they're even looking for more. So I think that they feel pretty strongly that they've put together a strong package, and I think they're pretty confident.
Do you agree the way he was arrested? This became a big issue yesterday. He came to New York, was at the Park Hyatt. He and his attorneys knew he was going to be hit with charges. In fact, his attorney said to the media before the indictment was unsealed, we anticipate racketeering and sex trafficking charges. But yet, despite that, they took issue with the way that he was arrested and he was apprehended and taken into custody. I think he wanted to surrender himself. Do you disagree or agree with the way that it was handled?
I'm a little agnostic on that. The bottom line is he's accused of very, very serious crimes. I mean, there was allegedly harm done to people. And if they want to go out and arrest him and do it in that manner, that's their prerogative. And frankly, that's their right. So for them to say, well, he was going to turn himself, he was going to do this, he was going to, we don't know what he was going to do, because he, right after or near the time of when the first search warrant was done at his place in LA, apparently he got on a plane and flew down to Florida. So he's already shown a propensity to move when there's pressure. So I think the New York authorities thought, well, we got to make sure we get this right. We want to take any chances of a flight from this guy, because if they try to track him down in a foreign country, it would be an absolute nightmare.
By the way, I was talking last night about this, and I was asked, why didn't he just leave the country? Right? He knew the charges were coming. Why didn't he just leave the country? And I said, well, the authorities could have arrested him immediately on the spot if they knew. But would that mean that they were tracking him beforehand? They knew when he was boarding a flight? And he's been moving around, right? He hasn't just stayed in one place during the course of this investigation. What would have prevented him from getting on the plane, having a flight plan for, I don't know, let's say California, let's say Colorado, let's say New York, and just saying, keep going and go to some country that doesn't have extradition? What prevented him from doing that? And what would be the way authorities could track him and stop him from doing that?
Well, to do that, it takes a lot of moving parts, because he's going to have to get pilots that are going to participate in that, conspiracy to flee. The pilots also have to file a flight plan. They also have to pick a country to go to that's going to be friendly to his issues, that's not going to extradite him. And he also, when that plan is filed, then he has to go through a process with Customs and Border Protection to be, in terms of being able to go to the next country. So I'm sure he had considered that, and I'm sure he took the advice of his lawyers and decided not to do that, because if he had fled, then this would have amplified, and then the full force of the United States government would have come down on tracking him down and bringing him back.
Do you think they were tracking him, though? Like, not necessarily like they had a surveillance team watching him at all times, but do you think investigators, do you think federal authorities kind of knew what he was doing?
Well, I think based upon the number of people who have come forward in terms of the indictment, I think they had people that were likely reporting on him, reporting on his actions and his movements, as well as the fact that they put so many resources to this. It would be reasonable for them to be watching his phones, watching his computer activity, and frankly having more people around him who are informing on him and his behavior.
I want to go into some of the evidence now and talk about what could be the strongest pieces. And to be clear, it's not entirely evident what the prosecution has, what people said to them, what the physical evidence is, what the digital evidence is, but let's go through it. So the prosecution says that many of the accusations against Combs can be corroborated by witnesses. And this is mentioned several times in the prosecution's letter to Judge Robin Tarnowski, where they were arguing against bail. For example, on page 2 of that letter, it says, quote, at least a dozen witnesses will confirm that they personally observed the defendant's violence towards women and or the injury sustained by women at the defendant's hand. Then on page 11, it says dozens of victims and witnesses have provided detailed, credible, and corroborated information against the defendant. Page 13, quote, as to witnesses to date, the government has conducted interviews with over 50 victims and witnesses, many of whom saw or experienced the defendant's abuse. The government only expects that number to continue to grow, given that the investigation, which is now public, is ongoing. So, Colin, how does law enforcement even go about this? Finding these people, conducting these interviews? What do you think that's about?
Well, 2 points here. Number one, he corroborated his behavior himself with that video that came out of him assaulting his girlfriend in the hotel, which was somewhat hard to watch as a father of a daughter and somebody who's been in law enforcement. Secondly, you talk to one person, and the most basic question you ask at the beginning, middle, or the end of the interview, is there anybody else? Oh yeah, I have this girlfriend that also suffered this type of behavior from him. And then you go to that person. And oh yeah, I got this person. I get this. So it ends up being a string or a network of people, because frankly, these women are most likely associates with each other or know each other, and they may even be close friends, and they've been in the circle that was basically targeted by Sean P. Combs, as well as the people around him that were assisting him in this behavior.
And we're going to also get to this a little bit when we talk about the digital evidence, but how do authorities corroborate what they're being told? Is it they hear a consistent pattern over speaking to multiple people? If 5 people say the same thing, okay, unless they coordinated this, it looks like it might be true, or it looks like there might be probable cause here. Or is it also looking at their phones, looking at other evidence that was collected during the course of the raids and saying that matches up to their story? I imagine the fact that, I said this before and I'll say it again, the idea that anybody can sue anybody. I mean, you're not supposed to file frivolous lawsuits, but it seems on the outset that you have prosecutors who are believing the accounts of these accusers, at the very least, it seems Cassandra Ventura, and filing criminal charges based on those accounts. So it seems that, authorities are believing what's being told, and they have the corroboration. It's not just the accounts of these people, but other evidence to back it up. Now, again, their stories might be similar, but I guess the question is, how do authorities corroborate what they're being told?
Well, the first thing, pattern is corroboration. So if you have 50 people saying the behavior was the same pattern, or he took the same actions, and he's been accused. We don't know until he's seen his day in court what really happened. But that's the first level of corroboration. The second thing is, apparently they seized videos from his house in California, and that's going to be extreme corroboration right there, because it's going to play out right in front of them. And then the third piece of this is the digital evidence, is the text messages, is the communications that he had with these women, based upon, and every one of them is likely saved those text messages on their phones and were able to give screenshots to the authorities. So it appears to me that the evidence is overwhelming. However, we're only going to know if it truly is overwhelming, once he has his day in court.
I think it is interesting how many people were apparently interviewed. And we're not entirely sure if all the people who filed lawsuits against Sean Combs are the main accusers, but it seems to me, at least from Cassandra Ventura's point of view, it seems that prosecutors have built their case based on those allegations. And I said this yesterday, and I say it today. It's one thing for somebody to sue somebody else, right? We have a lower standard. They shouldn't file frivolous lawsuits, but you have to, filing a civil lawsuit is very different than criminal charges. For prosecutors to believe these accounts and seemingly have it, people who are corroborating one another, there's a pattern there, but also maybe corroborated by the digital evidence, that is very significant, that you have civil lawsuits that may have triggered a criminal prosecution.
I think that's right. I think that the civil complaints, which we saw, there were many, definitely got the ball rolling. But I would say that it was the video of Cassie, that violent incident that we saw in that hotel lobby, that I guess came out of the blue, that really was what I think put the nail in the coffin. That was actually cited to in the indictment as something that they planned to use as evidence, and actually, I believe, led to the enhancements that we saw on what they're seeking as far as prison time. And
essentially, he could be looking at life in prison if he's convicted across the board. I am curious, is it a clear case for you when you hear the different accounts? Because they're saying there's a lot there. They're saying he operated a criminal organization that engaged in forced labor, kidnapping, arson, violence. They're saying that it was a common purpose to protect Diddy, to satisfy his sexual desires, to make money. There's a lot thrown out there. Is this a tough case to ultimately prosecute? And then you have the sex trafficking charge. You have the transportation for purposes of prostitution charge. Is this a tough case to prosecute? Is it a clear case to prosecute?
Yeah, I think it's always a tough case, right? I think that a lot of work and evidence has gone into leading up to now in terms of bringing this indictment, in terms of having that initial hearing and sort of having him arrested and bringing these charges. However, I do think that Diddy has very competent legal counsel. I think that they have seen this probably coming for some time. I think that while this case feels like R. Kelly all over again to me, where you obviously have, sort of a video of an underage person, that was involved and introduced, I think that this has, sort of samplings of that, but I assume that the defense is going to say that he did not do this, right? That this wasn't an organized crime syndicate that the prosecutors are accusing him of. This is a group of friends having a sex party. Yeah, it's not what you want to necessarily hear about. No one really possibly, likes it, but it is what it is. People like Diddy, people wanted to be around him, and they allowed themselves to be sort of manipulated sometimes into perhaps doing things that sound unsavory when heard in the news. I think that is the crux of what the defense's sort of argument will be, and I guess the question will be, what do you believe?
Continue on with this. When agents ended up searching Combs' homes back in March, they left with a lot of evidence. There were weapons, both seemingly legal and illegal. U.S. Attorney Damian Williams showed photographs of some of them during that news conference.
Here are some of the items that we recovered during the searches. As you can see here, this is a drum magazine, large capacity, and it contains, I believe, 59 rounds. I mentioned as well, we recovered 3 AR-15s. This is a close-up shot of one of the AR-15s, and you can see right here, the serial number has been thoroughly defaced. Another picture of more ammunition and parts of 2 AR-15s right there.
So the government is making the case that he did not do this on his own. He did not act alone. There were people who were around him. There were people who were helping him. And at the very least, there were witnesses to what was going on. I mean, for a conspiracy and criminal enterprise, racketeering, those kind of charges itself, you need more than just yourself. You need others. Someone needs to be a part of it. And just to go back to the indictment, one of the central allegations are these alleged illegal sexual events. So coming from the indictment, it says, quote, Combs and other members and associates of the Combs enterprise wielded the power and prestige of Combs' role at the Combs business to intimidate, threaten, and lure female victims into Combs' orbit, often under the pretense of a romantic relationship. Combs then used force, threats of force, and coercion to cause victims to engage in extended sex acts with male commercial sex workers that Combs referred to as, among other things, freak-offs. Freak-offs were elaborate and produced sex performances that Combs arranged, directed, pleasured himself during, and often electronically recorded. In arranging these freak-offs, Combs, with the assistance of members and associates of the Combs enterprise, transported and caused to be transported commercial sex workers across state lines and internationally. Freak-offs occurred regularly, sometimes lasted multiple days, and often involved multiple commercial sex workers. During freak-offs, Combs distributed a variety of controlled substances to victims, in part to keep the victims obedient and compliant. Sometimes, unbeknownst to the victims, Combs kept videos he filmed of victims engaging in sex acts with commercial sex workers. It goes on to say that members and associates of the Combs enterprise, including high-ranking supervisors, security staff, household staff, personal assistants, and other Combs business employees, facilitated the freak-offs. And that has become the question. Could other people be in trouble? Could they be prosecuted too? Now, to be clear, Combs is the only one who's currently charged right now. He's the only one named in that indictment. No one else is actually listed in that indictment. No one else is referenced by name. It is very general. But in the government's detention memo to the court arguing why Combs should be denied bail, and by the way, he's since been denied bail twice, they write, quote, the investigation into his and other co-conspirators' conduct is active and ongoing. And you know what spurned that question for us about whether other people could be in trouble too? Some of the reaction that we have been seeing post-indictment. Sports analyst Stephen A. Smith asking if people in Hollywood are scared.
Are the folks in Hollywood lying back in wait, wondering who's next? If you have workers that you can target and they can be punished, it's presumed they're going to dime him out, and ultimately they're going to force him to comply. And Diddy is going to dime out a whole bunch of people.
Then we have broadcast personality Charlemagne, who said on The Breakfast Club that others could be in trouble.
If he gets racketeering and sex trafficking for freak-offs, there will be others involved. If you ever been butt naked anywhere with Diddy, or half butt naked with Diddy, and there was some women around or some men around that he told you were part of the party, you're probably going to jail.
Rapper Foxy Brown wrote on her Instagram story, S about to really get crazy. So I guess the implication is maybe other people might be a part of this. Now, to be very clear, they're just commenting on the indictment. They aren't accused of being a part of this case in any way. And to couple that, here's what rapper 50 Cent had to say before the indictment back in August in an interview with Us Weekly. He wrote, "I'm the only person in hip-hop culture who has produced any hit television. Why wouldn't I be the person to produce it? And I'm not on the tapes. See, some of the people who have been around in the culture who are not saying anything, that's because they've been to the parties. They don't know what part of their experiences are on tape. So it keeps them quiet, and it looks like I'm the only guy, but I've been for years that something's not right." And again, he's not been implicated in Combs' alleged criminal allegations in any way. He's just commenting on it. And when you think of Combs, he has always been known for his extravagant parties, the white parties. We talked about this on a previous sidebar, that in light of these disturbing allegations that were made in the multiple lawsuits that he faced, accusing him of sexual assault and sex trafficking, that this is something that became an issue. In fact, here's what Ashton Kutcher said about Combs' parties on the show Hot Ones.
Okay, I've got a lot I can't tell. So, can't tell that one either.
Then this was NBA star LeBron James' comment.
Oh, hey, everybody know ain't no party like a Diddy party, so.
Yeah, that's what's up. Yeah.
We heard from rapper Uncle Luke, who spoke with the podcast We in Miami.
Did you party with Diddy a lot?
Oh, no, not really. I would go to the party and leave early.
Why wouldn't you stay?
I go to the party and leave early. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I don't know what goes on after hours, but
He wasn't trying to find out.
I wasn't trying to find out.
Now, to be clear, these statements from Kutcher, James, Uncle Luke, they were before this criminal indictment, and some even before these allegations of Combs even surfaced. And we have no indication or evidence that they knew anything that's being alleged or in any way a part of this case whatsoever. I just want to be clear about that. So as Combs currently sits behind bars after being denied bail twice, and as this case and investigation continue, I want to talk about this. So for that, I want to bring on Afi Patterson, attorney out of Los Angeles, litigation attorney out of Los Angeles. I like to think of her as our resident hip-hop expert. She knows so much about this, a hip-hop trial expert, I should say. Knows the ins and outs, has been following a lot of these cases recently. Afi, thank you so much for coming on. It's good to see you. As I said, it's been a minute since we've had a chance to talk. I'm going to ask you the question I've asked every single person I've asked this week. Your reaction to the arrest and indictment of Sean Combs. Is it what you expected?
I said this back in November. Yes, absolutely. It's what I expected. I think that he was indicted a long time ago, and the indictment was held. I think they've had this, they've had this for a minute. The question is, that's everybody's asking right now is, are there going to be other people? But what we've seen right now is just one person. When people think of RICO, they think, of course, of a huge enterprise. But all you need with RICO is one person, two acts over a 10-year period. It's super easy to get a RICO charge, and super easy, of course, to get an indictment. So it's absolutely what I expected. And I also expect a conviction, a swift one.
But in the indictment, they mention not one or two people. They mention a network. They're mentioning a lot of people who helped be a part of this or facilitated this. So is there a feeling right now? And I guess the question could be, when you hear these statements being made by prosecutors in their filings and the United States attorney in this press conference, the argument is, and you correct me if I'm wrong, is this a siren out to everybody? Listen, he just got indicted. You come to us before we come to you. Do you get that sense?
No, I think that when you put the full weight of the U.S. Attorney's Office behind any statement, it's intimidating. I think that it was more like, you'll be in trouble if you don't respond favorably to us. And we see that in that only one person was charged. Only Puffy was charged in this RICO issue. And I think more than anything, they want people to participate. They want people to willingly provide information. They don't want to have to bring down the full weight of the office and, use unnecessary resources. Come forward if you have information. If we know who you are and where you are and we come to talk to you, play nice with us, and nothing will happen. That's what I got from that.
I mean, why do you think there was only one person mentioned in this indictment. Obviously, there could be a superseding indictment. There could be other people who are additionally charged. We've seen that in cases before. Do you think that this is common to just indict Sean Combs, the alleged head of this organization, and that we might see other people indicted? Or do you think there's something else there, that they already have everybody that they need? They are going to be cooperating witnesses. There's nobody else to charge at this time.
I don't think there's anyone else to charge at this time. I think they wanted Puffy, and they went after him, and they got what they needed. And now all they need is more support to buoy their position. I think that if anything, with the more people that come forward, there could be more charges. I'll tell you, when I read the indictment, I thought that there would be more financial crimes, more drug crimes. I was a little shocked that it was mainly surrounding the facts that we saw in Ventura's complaint back in November. So if anything, I think more charges are possible.
Well, I guess the question is, you can know Sean Combs and not be indicted. There has to be more to be criminally charged. You don't believe that they've spoken to the people who have been working with Combs and saying, listen, I can prosecute you. If you are facilitating these freak-offs and you are drugging people or you're bringing people across lines for commercial sex and you're engaging in this, I could easily charge you with racketeering. But I'm going to work out a deal with you where I won't prosecute you. You just have to testify against Combs. You don't think that's happened behind the scenes already?
Absolutely, that's happened.
Because you said before, I don't think there's any deals to be made. I don't think anybody else is to be charged. There are people who could be charged.
Oh, no, I don't think anybody else is going to be charged.
But you say that there are people who could be that the government knows.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And I think that they'll be testifying, and if he does not take a plea, if they don't offer him anything, there's going to be so much that comes out that just shocks everybody.
So, Afi, let's say you have a client and they say to you, listen, oh my gosh, look, I went to 12 of Diddy's parties. How do I know I'm in trouble? What makes someone in trouble if they're at these parties? Is it that they attended them? Is it they witnessed it, they didn't do anything? Is it that they partook in it? What would make somebody in legal trouble from a criminal standpoint?
Well, if we look at the indictment and, look at the charges, and it's all about facilitation. So I wouldn't necessarily be concerned if you were an attendee. I don't think you're a target if you're an attendee. I don't think that supports their prosecution of Puffy, Sean Combs. I think I would say it's nothing I would worry about, and I wouldn't go ahead and volunteer any information. Nobody's looking for you. If you're just a participant at a party, be quiet, sit down, relax your nerves, and I just probably counsel them on that. But I think that if you were any type of employee, if you were there, if you were, a driver, a bodyguard, a chef, if you were a trainer, any of the service workers who were around, anybody, a publicist, anybody who worked on behalf of the Combs empire, they should be concerned. But attendees, I wouldn't say it's a big deal.
Because it's aiding and abetting, right? Essentially.
If you're facilitating, if you're working with the Combs enterprise, I think that's what the prosecution would be looking at. You are facilitating these criminal activities. Let's
say you engaged in one of these freak-offs. Do you think you could be prosecuted for it?
I don't think so. I think, freak-offs, prostitution, it's such an interesting line, when we're talking about morality versus illegality. Participating in a freak-off, to what extent did you participate in it? What role did you play? Was it willingly? Did you willingly play a role? Were you forced? What did you do? Now, if you were my client and you participated, I have a ton more questions. But if you are just an attendee at a party consuming, any type of illicit drugs or alcohol or participating in any sexual activity, I don't think that that's a big deal in this case.
Let me ask you this. People have been quite vocal since the allegation surfaced against Combs. People have been quite vocal after the indictment, but it's also been interesting to see the people who have been silent and who haven't said anything. And these are people who used to, associate themselves with Combs. Is that because, from a PR point of view, they don't want to say anything about him? Or if I had a list of the over 50 witnesses and alleged victims of Combs that the government says that they've already interviewed, and I look at that list, there's a lot of people I recognize. What do you think?
I mean, That's such an interesting question. You know, they've been silent. Silent how? Like, what do you want from a person? Do you want them to make a press release about their support of him or their innocence? It's like, I don't know if you've ever heard the saying, a hit dog hollers. I would be quiet as well. You know, I'd stay out of it until I'm summoned.
Well, I tell you this, when Harvey Weinstein, the allegations came out, when he was charged, you had a lot of high-profile people who came out and talked about him and said what they observed about him. Some regretted their decisions, their associations. I don't know if you're seeing that so much with Combs, and that's why I think you're seeing people say maybe they're afraid to speak up, and maybe they're about to run to the government and with information, or maybe they're one of their cooperating witnesses that they've already spoken with the government. I think that's why.
Yeah, so what's so interesting is I think that we have been seeing people who have been affected by Sean Combs. We've seen it in the lawsuits. He's got innumerable lawsuits out. You know, we've got people who have been speaking out on the blogs, who've been doing interviews on the blogs. People have been ringing the bell for years, but even more recently, you know, you've got people who have been in his inner circle. Who have been opinion treated unfairly, who have been ringing the alarm and saying things. And I think that, you know, just because the most high profile person you can think of hasn't said anything, you know, I don't think that doesn't mean people aren't saying things. Again, if you're my client, you know, please don't be a hit dog hollering out here. I would say rest your nerves and wait until you're summoned, or if you have anything that, you know, you think is vital and you want to be involved in this investigation, like, let's talk about that.
At the time, we only speculated that investigators collected electronic evidence, but now we know for sure. According to the indictment against Diddy, investigators seized more than 1,000 bottles of baby oil and lubricant from his home. The court doc states these items were used in something referred to as freak-offs, which were elaborate and produced sex performances that Combs arranged, directed, masturbated during, and often electronically recorded. In arranging these freak-offs, Combs, with the assistance of members and associates of the Combs enterprise, transported and caused to be transported commercial sex workers across state lines and internationally. During freak-offs, Combs distributed a variety of controlled substances to victims, in part to keep the victims obedient and compliant. Sometimes, unbeknownst to the victims, Combs kept videos he filmed of victims engaging in sex acts with commercial sex workers. After freak-offs, Combs and the victims typically received IV fluids to recover from the physical exertion and drug use. So Diddy's business employees allegedly facilitated these freak-offs by stocking the hotel rooms in advance with the required freak-off supplies, including controlled substances, baby oil, lubricant, extra linens, and lighting, cleaning the hotel rooms after the freak-offs to try to mitigate room damage, arranging for travel for victims, commercial sex workers, and Combs to and from freak-offs, resupplying Combs with the requested supplies, delivering large sums of cash to Combs to pay the commercial sex workers, and scheduling the delivery of IV fluids. So these items were collected during the federal raids, including narcotics and hundreds of bottles of lube and baby oil. There were also electronic files of these freak-offs, and the feds collected those too. In addition to all this, investigators seized AR-15 guns, ammunition, and a large-capacity drum magazine from Diddy's home. Since those raids in March, federal prosecutors have been crafting their case against Diddy, which led to grand jury proceedings against him. So he was indicted on Monday and taken into custody, and on Tuesday, that indictment was unsealed. Also on Tuesday, Diddy appeared in federal court where he pleaded not guilty to the charges against him. During the hearing, Diddy was also denied bail, a federal judge ruling he must remain in custody until trial. With all that in mind, let's take a closer look at what exactly the feds collected from Diddy's homes. For that, we turn to former CIA officer and FBI agent Tracy Walder. This indictment that just came down, I know we were kind of expecting it to happen, but when it did, what were your thoughts?
Yeah, you know, I had expected, I'd said before that I thought we'd get an indictment within 6 to 9 months. People weren't happy with me because they thought that was just too long. But it was almost exactly 6 months, actually, since the warrants were served on both of his homes. I think it's not a surprise to me because I'm glad he's being charged with this. I wholeheartedly thought that he would have a RICO, a racketeering charge. I knew that would be something that they would get him on. I was concerned that they wouldn't get him on human trafficking because sometimes that can be really difficult to prove. And I just always worry that those cases fall through the cracks and then justice isn't served for the victims. And so I was pleased to see that he was charged with that, so that hopefully he could be held accountable.
Much of the evidence that the prosecution now has against Diddy came from the federal raids. Talking about a federal search warrant, what does that look like, just generically?
Right. So in this case, and I don't recall if I talked to you about this or maybe Jesse, but when that warrant was served back in March, the question was, is if they served the warrant, why can't they just arrest him? And again, as you mentioned, they probably didn't have enough evidence at that time to do so. However, to get a warrant like that, where it's served simultaneously and, in a surprising manner, they really had to prove one of two things, excuse me. The first being that evidence was imminently going to be destroyed, or that the lives of people were in danger. I believe that it was the former that they were probably able to prove, is that evidence may have been going to be destroyed. And that's why they served the warrants. And that's why they were able to serve the warrants, to preserve that evidence.
I feel like a lot of us who don't have experience in the FBI or CIA, we just picture movies or TV shows when you see people come in and opening drawers and closets and going through everything. But what does it really look like when they're there on the ground serving these federal warrants?
Yeah, I mean, in a case like this, obviously you're not making any kind of a dynamic entry. This isn't a hostage situation, right? Where that's not what's happening here. However, they did know that there would be weapons there, armed security, those kinds of things. That's why you saw those warrants being served by, for the most part, a tactical SWAT team. Simply, that is procedure to keep everyone safe. A lot of people were frustrated when they saw the video that came out of the warrant, that his home was, in, I guess, disarray. But again, and I had said this before, my gut said they were looking for digital evidence, which is in that indictment. There's a lot of mentions to digital evidence. And that's why they tore up couch cushions. That's why they made holes in walls. They were looking for flash drives, tiny devices where these things were stored. And so all of that is done methodically. It's all cataloged. And in a case like this, where you're not necessarily rushing, to put out a fire or something like that, it was all done in a very methodical way. You typically go through room by room to catalog all of that evidence.
Taking a closer look at all that evidence, Diddy had 3 AR-15s seized during the federal raids that had been defaced. What do you think that would look like, though? Because weapons obviously are very dangerous. We don't want them to go off. How is that collected?
Well, they typically clear the weapon, right? They're going to go ahead and take the cartridge out of it and make sure that there are no rounds, obviously, in the chamber, and then disassemble it to be taken back as evidence. What's interesting is the AR-15s that they found. Some people have AR-15s. It's legal in some places, but they found that the serial number was scraped off of them, and that I thought was interesting, because I don't know if Diddy didn't want those traceable to him, or if he had received them on the black market.
You know what's interesting is that we just recently, in the second attempted assassination of former President Donald Trump, we saw those federal charges for tampering with the weapon, where he, the alleged attempted assassin, scraped off or made not legible the serial number. So why is it that Diddy might not have received charges like that?
So in terms of Mr. Ralph, that's the individual currently charged. In that, I believe those are just simply placeholder charges, if you want me to be honest with you. I don't think they're really going to move forward with those. I think they're going to go with much larger charges, but they haven't had the element of time, right, that they've had with Diddy. They arrested him immediately after, 45 minutes after this attempt. And so they did what they could with what they had at that particular moment in time to keep him in custody. And so I think that's why you didn't see those with Diddy. These are much larger charges with Diddy. They don't need those kind of placeholder charges to keep him in jail until they can get more. So that's why I think you don't see those.
As far as the AR-15s, ammunition, I know that they mentioned a drum magazine as well. Where are those stored now? Where does all of that go?
An evidence locker of some sort, I'm assuming to the FBI. The FBI, their local office, will have an evidence locker that takes in all of that, catalogs it, and keeps it together basically on a case-by-case basis. It's all labeled based on a case.
Another thing that was collected during all of this is narcotics. So there are illegal drugs like meth and also prescription drugs too. I'm wondering if federal investigators are going to look and track down who provided these to Diddy. Where was the source for these prescription or other street drugs that were in the homes?
I think that that's a possibility, especially based on what we saw with Matthew Perry and the ketamine queen and the doctors and all the other, I think, 5 individuals who were ultimately charged in that. They may be going on different sort of avenues in terms of charging. I don't think they're done in terms of charging. And I do think with this recent crackdown on this, that they very well may go after those individuals, whomever the suppliers were.
Another thing that everyone seems to be talking about from this indictment is the 1,000 bottles of baby oil and personal lubricant that were collected between Diddy's 2 homes. This one really stood out to me. I guess, what do you just make of that?
I don't know a way to say this. Based on what was in the indictment regarding these freak offs that's what they call them in here. I think that's what Diddy called them, quite frankly. The severity at which they were, the length and duration at which they were, I'm actually not surprised that that's what was collected ultimately from his home. It's absolutely horrific. The fact that some of these victims needed IV rehydration afterwards, couldn't go out because they were so injured as a result of this. It's absolutely horrific. And now, based on what we've learned of the magnitude of those freak offs, it's unfortunately not surprising.
What would it look like for investigators to go through and, I guess, document everything that they have as far as the electronic evidence while maintaining the anonymity of the survivors, I guess?
Right. And I think that's why in the indictment, you really don't hear much mention of victims. For those who have read it, there's victim 1 that is mentioned in it, but there are no names that are mentioned. And I believe that that's done on purpose. The prosecution wants to have a rapport with these victims to continue to get information from them. And we don't want to re-victimize them. No one deserves that. And so I think doing this in an anonymous way is what we should be doing with these victims. But I think part of the issue, part of what took some time actually in terms of going through all of this, as you mentioned, there was video evidence of these freak offs. You have to go through now and identify everyone who is in those videos. And that really can take some time. It's a very tedious task. I don't know that they were able to identify every single person that appeared in these videos, but I am certain that they were able to identify some of them. And those are the interviews that they did. And that's what ultimately led to an indictment.
These are some of the major things that people are talking about because they were mentioned in the indictment. But is it possible that the feds collected even more information that we don't know about yet? It may come out at trial.
100%. I'm certain of it. I think someone said, this is a big indictment, 14 pages. In my opinion, it's actually not that big. I've seen bigger indictments, which in my opinion also leads me to believe that all of the evidence is not included in it. And they're entitled to do that. If you actually look at the Brian Kohberger case, they didn't include all the evidence in the indictment. Yes, it needs to be handed over to the defense, obviously, but it doesn't need to necessarily be in the indictment. You only need to put in the information that led to it. And so my guess is they have more. They just didn't put it all in there.
Then there's the time frame to consider, from the raids in March all the way to the grand jury and indictment in September. So that's 6 months of prosecutors gathering evidence, investigators going through it, you said methodically, making sure that they have all their ducks in a row, so to speak. What would that part of it actually look like? Would they highlight or flag something that they thought would bolster the prosecution's case when they came across it?
I've never thought about it from, the prosecution defense point of view. I just thought about it from the FBI agent point of view, because obviously our biggest thing is making sure that we collect the evidence properly, log it properly, and process it properly, because if we don't, it cannot be used by the prosecution or by the defense. So then that is problematic. Also, the biggest thing, if you are looking at bringing someone up on charges, particularly federal ones, the reality is we want to make sure we almost have overabundance of evidence to almost over convict the individual. And so I think that's, from an FBI perspective, what they were working on.
On top of Diddy's 3 federal charges, Tracy says other charges could be on the way.
Yeah, I think one of the things in reading the indictment, this is all on video, right? A lot of this is on video. And I would be interested to see if other people are going to be charged. I know they talked about the fact that people procured some of these individuals for them and drugs and all of that. And so I would be interested to know if any of those people will face charges at some point. I don't know the answer to that, but I think that these victims deserve that, quite frankly, because of what was done to them. So I'll be interested to see if more charges come out against some of the individuals who facilitated this.
Following Diddy's indictment on Monday, he pleaded not guilty to charges on Tuesday. A statement from his legal team reads, quote, "Sean Diddy Combs is a music icon, self-made entrepreneur, loving family man, and proven philanthropist who has spent the last 30 years building an empire, adoring his children, and working to uplift the Black community. He is an imperfect person, but is not criminal." To his credit, Mr. Combs has been nothing but cooperative with this investigation, and he voluntarily relocated to New York last week in anticipation of these charges. Please reserve your judgment until you have all the facts. These are the acts of an innocent man with nothing to hide, and he looks forward to clearing his name in court. For more Diddy content and every update that develops, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Reporting for Law and Crime, I'm